The static hit first, sharp, glitchy like someone slicing into the middle of a scream. I was alone in my apartment lights, off except for the laptop glow headphones tight against my ears. My fingers hovered over the playback controls, barely touching. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. Then it happened again. Code 1033 officer needs assistance. That was the night Ethan died. I'd heard the call 100 times, but this time something was off. Buried underneath the official dispatch, there was another voice, faint, flat, almost robotic, like someone mimicking the code but getting the tone wrong, like reading a script they didn't believe in. I replayed it. Again. Each time it felt colder, more intentional. My hand shook, knocking over the mug next to me. Coffee spilled, but I didn't even look down. This wasn't a system error. This wasn't just bad reception. This was planted. Outside, the town was already wrapping Ethan in honour. Flags at half-mast. Badges polished to mirror shine. Every porch had blue ribbons. Everyone had something nice to say. Of course they did. He was the golden boy. The kind of person people remembered for all the right reasons. I looked at the screen. The audio file blinked at me like it was daring me to push further. My heart was pounding louder than the static. Then came the service. Church was packed. Rows and rows of uniforms, police sheriffs, even state troopers. Suits and medals everywhere. I stood at the back. No one asked me to sit up front. No one even turned around. I used to think I was imagining that part, how invisible I always felt. But that day, I didn't have to imagine anything. Dad stepped up to the podium. He looked the same as always, rigid like emotion was a weakness he'd never allow. His voice carried straight through the church. Ethan was born for this. From the moment he could walk, he understood sacrifice. Then, the pause. A breath. I knew what was coming. Rebecca! He didn't look at me. She's always been great with the paperwork. A few people chuckled, the polite kind of laugh people use when they're not sure if a joke is appropriate. My jaw clenched. I didn't flinch, though. I've learned how not to flinch. But inside, something snapped. This was the last time. I wasn't just the paperwork girl. I was the one who handled his last call. I was the one who flagged the error that night, and I was the one they told to let it go. Even now, I can hear it, my supervisor's voice. It's a glitch, Wilson. Let it go. You're not a cop. Right, I'm not a cop, but I'm not stupid either. Ethan was more than just the department's poster boy. He was my brother. He was the one who texted me memes during night shift just to make sure I was awake. The one who brought me gas station donuts when my rent was late because no one should deal with life on an empty stomach. The only person who ever made me feel seen. And now, he was dead. And something about that call wasn't right. The organist played Amazing Grace. People cried. Mum dabbed her eyes with a tissue. She hadn't said much to me since the shooting. She hadn't defended me when the rumours started. Hadn't stopped Dad when he told reporters that Rebecca didn't have the same calling. It's funny, isn't it? You grow up thinking your family's supposed to be your shelter. But sometimes they're the storm. I didn't cry at the funeral. I couldn't. I just stood there with my hands balled up, nails digging into my palms. People walked past Dad shaking his hand like he was the one who died. He was a hero, they said. You must be so proud. No one looked at me. I wasn't in the slideshow. I wasn't in the speech. The program said survived by his parents and sister. That's it. Just words. Flat like I wasn't even really part of the loss. But I was holding a different story. One they didn't want. The call log from that night didn't match the response team. The vehicle ID popped up in 2 places. The signal was rerouted. No one questioned it. No one looked deeper. Except me. After the reception, I stepped outside. The air was sharp. Elmwood was quiet, eerily so. A news van still idled nearby. Someone swept petals off the church steps. and I just stood there, staring at the sky, thinking even the clouds look like they're waiting for something to break. That night, I went back to the file. The same one I'd listened to 20 times already. I pressed play again. Static. The call. Then, that voice. Wrong voice. Wrong timing. And this time, I said it out loud. To the silence. To the dark. The system lied. I pressed play again. Static. The call. Then, that voice. Wrong voice. Wrong timing. And this time, I said it out loud. To the silence. To the dark. The system lied. I didn't sleep after that. I just sat there, letting the glow from my laptop bleed into the early morning, trying to calm the storm inside me. But it only got louder. When I returned to the church later that morning, most of the crowd had thinned. Someone was stacking chairs. Someone else gathered leftover flowers. The air felt too still, like everyone had already moved on, and I was the only one still stuck in that damn dispatch room at 10:41 p.m. That's when I heard it. A voice behind me, low, casual, sharp in its carelessness. Did she even work that night? I froze. He didn't know I was close enough to hear. Probably wouldn't have cared. It was the kind of comment people say with a smirk, assuming it won't echo. But it did, inside me. Yes, I worked. I flagged the errors, I raised the red flags, and no one gave a damn. Now they were pretending I didn't even exist on that shift. I didn't say anything. I just turned toward the hallway, needing air, needing space. That's when I saw Officer Lillian Vega standing by the bulletin board cup of church coffee in hand. She caught my eye. There was something in her face, something like recognition. People say stupid things at funerals, she said, almost gently. Yeah, I replied, unsure if my voice worked. Then she added, I heard it too. What? He said. I've been you. She didn't need to explain. I understood. And for a second, I wasn't alone. But it passed. Because this wasn't about comfort. This was about clarity. I walked out of the side door into the grey light. The wind tugged at the hem of my coat. That's when Dad's voice echoed in my head. Not the warm, memory kind, but the cold, public version Rebecca has always been our silent one. He'd said it like a compliment. Everyone nodded politely. No one questioned how praise could sting like that. Our silent one. It was a branding, a warning, stay in your lane, don't make noise. Be useful, but never memorable. I clutched my bag tighter. That night back home I couldn't shake it. His words, the whisper. The way, even at my brother's funeral, I was just edited out. No photos of me in the slideshow. No mention of me in the eulogy. I wasn't part of their story of Ethan. But I had my own. I couldn't sleep, so I paced. Then I grabbed a blank notebook. I clicked on a pen and sat down at my kitchen table, surrounded by leftover food I didn't eat and sympathy cards I hadn't opened. And I wrote. First line. If I don't tell the truth, no one will. Then I wrote everything I remembered from that night. The exact time the call came in. The way the ID didn't match. The fact that 2 cars were supposedly in the same location. The strange pause between transmissions. The second voice that didn't belong. I wrote about my supervisor brushing me off. About how no one even asked me to submit a statement. About how fast they wanted to bury it all, literally and figuratively. I wrote about being called the silent one. About how silence isn't always a choice. Sometimes it's a sentence. Then I wrote about Ethan, my brother. The one who used to bring me cheap donuts on double shifts. The one who said you're the one keeping the chaos from collapsing Becca. Don't let them convince you otherwise. I missed him so much it hurt to breathe. But I couldn't just mourn him. I had to defend him. Because if what I heard was real, if someone faked a call or covered up a response, then Ethan didn't just die in the line of duty. He was set up or sacrificed. I closed the notebook after 10 pages. My hand was sore. My eyes burned, but I had started something. Something no one else could do. They could erase me from their version of that night. But I was writing my own, and I wasn't done. I opened the dispatch software again, cursor blinking at the same log that had become my obsession. I clicked on the date. February 14th, 13 a.m. Ethan's shift. I scrolled looking for anything unusual. There, the unit ID, I knew Unit 47B Ethan's cruiser, logged in at the East Oak call. Then, I saw another entry identical timestamp. Unit 47B positioned 2 blocks away at Elm Street. That couldn't be. A vehicle can't be in 2 places at once. My heart raced. I highlighted both entries. Zoomed in, zoomed out, filled with that awful, exhilarating charge when something clicks in your mind. I excused myself and called over my supervisor, Rayner, who looked like he'd aged 20 years since the shooting. Rayner, I said, pointing. This entry, Unit 47B, is marked at Oak and Elm at the same time. He leaned over, looked at the screen, then straight at me. That's a glitch. No, I said flatly. You can't have 1 car in 2 places. He sighed. It's a system error. Happens all the time. Except not with the system that tracks live GPS, I said, not hiding how my voice shook. This log combines dispatch time and route location. But we have GPS matching it to this call and to this one. He shook his head. Let it go, Rebecca. You're not a cop. There it was again. Not a rebuke, an erasure. I closed the laptop hard enough to rattle the table. Then, what am I supposed to see? He walked away without answering. He was the authority figure I'd lost respect for at that moment, not just a supervisor, but a protector who chose to protect the system, not the people. I turned my focus to the audio. I isolated the segment code 10 to 33, which had faded into the static. I adjusted the frequency filter until I heard another layer. A hidden transmission, low and methodical, definitely human. Not a machine, and not someone in the dispatch booth. The radio crackled again louder. Redirect to South Ridge Patrol, the voice said, but the tone was flat-clipped. The kind of tone you use when reading a script, not the kind you use when responding to an emergency. I replayed it. I slowed it down. I slowed it further until I could see the waveform shift. There was a delay, half a second between the dispatch code and the redirect order. There was no record of an official override. I printed the log, the GPS map, and the isolated audio transcript. I taped them to my desk in a rough grid timeline location voice sample. Anyone could see something didn't add up. The next morning, I walked into the dispatch center with a stack of papers. Radio on my hip, I scanned the room. The other dispatchers avoided eye contact. They'd learned what crossing Rayner looked like. Everyone okay? I asked, setting the papers on a workstation. No one answered. I took a breath. This is what I found. I talked to them through the discrepancies. I pointed to the unit ID duplications. I played the filtered clip. A murmur went through the room. Not excitement, but recognition, like they were watching me walk on a tightrope, but didn't know whether to cheer or step away. Then Rayner walked in. Looks like he expected me to melt down. "What's going on, Wilson?" he asked. I showed him. I watched his face tighten. He pulled me aside, lowered his voice. "Don't bring that stuff in here." I leaned in too. "I'm not here to break anything. I'm here to fix it." He snorted. "If this gets into the wrong ears, you will be the problem." I stared at him, in his eyes. That worn blue uniform that used to be my goal when I was younger. A stupid, hopeful goal. Now, it symbolized something else. We stood there a tense second longer before he dismissed me. Back to radio duty. So I slipped away to an unused corner of the center, opened the notebook and added another entry, Log shows duplicate unit ID timestamps, oak and elm. Audio overlay found. No official override. Ink in my own handwriting. Like evidence. I also added a note, investigate Rayner's override permissions. The first time I wrote his name in that book, it felt like a gamble, but I was tired of losing. That evening, I replayed everything, listened until my ears buzzed. Then, I wrote again. I found the signal, I found the glitch, I found proof. Proof was power. And once I had proof, silence wasn't an option. I submitted my own report, not through Rayner. Direct email to Internal Affairs with my files attached, CPU logs, audio clip, GPS, prints my annotations. Then I sat back heart-pounding. The moment of truth wasn't coming, it was here. What mattered now was what they would do next. I knew I needed an ally, someone who had been close to Ethan. Jaime Tran popped into my mind, young, driven sharp as hell, and she'd always been a friend to both of us. I pulled up her contact, stared at her name for a long second. Then I got a call. She picked up on the third ring. Becca. Hey, I said, my voice lower than I intended. You got a minute? Yeah. What's going on? I think something's off. The night Ethan died, I've been going through the logs, audio timestamps. There's something that doesn't make sense. Silence stretched for a beat. Then, she said quietly, I remember that call. Something about it didn't sit right. That was all I needed. That small sliver of validation. Can we meet? We met an hour later at an all-night diner near the edge of town, neutral ground. She slid into the booth across from me. No uniform, just a hoodie and jeans, hair tied back. For the first time in days, I didn't feel invisible. I pulled out the tablet, the printouts. I showed her the logs, pointed at the overlapping timestamps, the phantom voice on the call. Jamie's brow furrowed. This redirect, it doesn't sound like you. Or dispatch. It's not, I said. I isolated the frequency. Whoever made it, it wasn't routed through our system. She leaned in. We played the audio together. 3 times. The third time she caught it too. That voice is off, like someone reading from a script. Exactly, I said, my pulse ticking up. It's like someone was mimicking the cadence of our code, but without context. No emotion, no urgency, just hollow. We were quiet for a moment. The clink of dishes and hum of fluorescent lights surrounded us like a blanket of noise. You said Ethan texted you before his call, she asked. I nodded. Routine check-in. He told me he was heading towards South Ridge, not Oak, but the system rerouted him at the last second. Jaime exhaled sharply. South Ridge was supposed to be closed for construction. No units were supposed to go through there. I stared at her. Then, why did the voice say otherwise? We both knew the answer. We just didn't want to say it out loud. Someone inside, she finally whispered. Someone with access. I swallowed hard. I sent the files to internal. I needed you to see it first. Jaime glanced around the diner, her jaw tense. You're not paranoid, Rebecca. You're right. I always thought you were just quiet, but maybe you were the only one listening. That hit me harder than I expected. I smiled faintly. Funny how silence makes people assume you're not paying attention. Yeah, Jaime said, standing. But sometimes silence is how people survive. She scribbled her number on the back of a napkin. This is my personal line, not the department's. Use it if things get weird. Thanks, Jaime. As she walked out, I felt something shift inside me. Not hope, something harder. Like resolve. That night, I returned home, fired up the software again. I listened for the echo again and again, trying to find its origin. I compared it with old training tapes, live calls, even Ethan's voice on previous dispatches. Then I noticed something strange. The echoed voice didn't just mimic the cadence, it mimicked Ethan's vocal pitch, slightly higher than the average cop. Someone had tried to make it sound like him, but it wasn't him. The thought made my stomach turn. It wasn't just a reroute, It was a fake voice, carefully crafted, slipped into the system under the radar, like a ghost trying to rewrite the last chapter of Ethan's life. I wrote again in my notebook synthetic echo, designed to resemble Ethan. Intentional. The more I looked, the more convinced I became someone had erased the real call and replaced it with something manufactured. And that meant this wasn't negligence, it was manipulation. The kind of manipulation that kills. And maybe it wasn't the first time. That thought sat heavy in my chest as I looked out across Elmwood's quiet-trimmed streets. This town always wore silence like a badge of honour. People here smiled, wide, waved politely, kept secrets locked behind painted doors and manicured lawns. Everything looked like it worked until you got too close. Then you saw the cracks. Not from time or wear, but from pressure, from what gets shoved underneath until it splinters. Ethan once told me back when I was still learning the dispatch codes, "If anything ever happens to me, go to the logs." I thought he was joking. Back then, everything about him felt indestructible. But he said it with that edge in his voice, the one he only used when he meant something for real. He knew something I didn't. Or maybe he just trusted me to look if others wouldn't. I started backing up everything. Audio files, unit locations, dispatch overlays. It started small just in case. Then it became a habit. Then it became a shield. And now it was a weapon. But even with the data in hand, the weight of the town pressed down like fog. Like the air itself was saying, "Let it go, sweetheart. We just buried your brother." That's what Mum whispered one night, barely audible over the clink of her teacup. She didn't even look at me, just stared out the kitchen window at nothing in particular. "Don't stir trouble, sweetheart," she said. "We just buried your brother." And that's when it hit me. She wasn't trying to protect me. She was trying to protect the version of Ethan the town had already sanctified. Any truth I found would rewrite him. And people around here didn't rewrite heroes. But they weren't there that night. None of them were when I was 15 and sitting at the dinner table trying not to cry. It had started like any other dinner. Chicken, overcooked green beans, Ethan talking about some new achievement. Ethan got picked to lead the school patrol again, Dad said with pride, like he was announcing a Medal of Honor. 3rd year in a row. Officer Martinez says he's a natural. Mum chimed in, eyes gleaming. And he's already helping plan the safety drills. Imagine how that will look on college applications. Then their eyes turned to me. Dad asked, and you, "How was gym class?" I tried to keep my voice light. I passed the mile run. "Barely," Dad chuckled. "Barely passing still isn't passing, you know," Mum added too gently. "To feel kind, Rebecca. Honey, you can't just sit at a computer all day and expect the world to notice you." My chest tightened. I looked down at my plate. I hadn't even touched the chicken. Then Dad leaned back in his chair, took a sip of water and said it. "Maybe she's just not cut out for real work." Just like that. Not even angry, just dismissive. Casual cruelty. Like I was some optional background noise in a house built for Ethan. My fork slipped from my fingers and hit the plate with a sharp clang. I stood too fast. The chair scraped behind me. I didn't say a word. I just walked down the hall into the bathroom and locked the door. The sobs hit before I could even sit down. Not the quiet kind. The gut-wrenching kind that shake your shoulders and make it hard to breathe. 10 minutes later, a knock. Soft, gentle. "Hey," Ethan said from the other side. "It's me." I didn't answer. "I brought you something," he said. "I stole your favourite snack from the kitchen. Don't tell Mum." Still silence. Then, through broken breath, I asked the only thing that had haunted me for years. "Do you think I'm even their real kid? Why do they treat me like I don't exist?" He didn't hesitate. "You're my sister Becca. That's never going to change. Maybe this is just the hard part before your dream starts." He didn't try to fix it. He just sat outside the door until I was ready to come out. When I finally did, he gave me a small smile, held out the snack like it was a peace treaty and said, "Come on, let's get out of the house for a bit." We slipped outside into the backyard. Barefoot, the grass felt cool and damp beneath our feet, soft like velvet with the evening dew. Everything was still. You could hear the distant chirping of crickets, the occasional rustle of wind through the maple trees. Above us stretched a sky so dark and wide it made everything else feel small. The stars blinked faintly scattered like whispers across a black canvas. Ethan walked slowly beside me, not saying much at first. He didn't rush me, just stayed close, letting the quiet speak for us. That was his gift, he knew, when silence was needed. Then, in his usual gentle way, he asked, "You ever think about radio signals?" I glanced at him confused. "Not really. They're always out there," he said, motioning to the sky. "Invisible, constant. But you only hear them if you're tuned in. Every frequency has its own pattern. Most people. They miss it. Too busy, too loud." He looked at me, then really looked at me. "But not you. Maybe that's your thing, Becca. Maybe you hear what others don't." My throat tightened. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Like he meant it. Like I mattered in a way no one else ever made me feel. He stopped at the garden steps and sat down, patting the spot beside him. I joined him. The night air carried the scent of wet earth, fresh grass, a hint of laundry detergent from a neighbour's line. Familiar. Safe. "You know," he said, voice low, "people will try to make you feel small. Like your way of being doesn't count. Like quiet means weak. But it's not. You hear the cracks. You notice the gaps. That's power." I stared ahead, blinking against the sting in my eyes. "But what's the point if no one listens when I speak up?" Ethan didn't flinch. "They will. One day, you just keep listening, keep writing. The truth always has a signal. You just have to be the one patient enough to stay tuned." That moment, I didn't realize it then, but it became armor. I held onto it, replayed it when everything else went dark. We sat out there until the wind picked up and the night settled heavier around us. Then he pointed toward a cluster of stars. "See that? That's Orion. The hunter." I nodded. "But you don't have to be a warrior like him. Not the way people expect. You've got your own way. A quieter kind. Doesn't mean it's less strong." For the first time that night, I smiled. Not because it was fixed. Not because I didn't still feel hollow. But because someone saw me, and that changed everything. Years later, that same silence filled my apartment as I copied Ethan's logs to an encrypted drive. One local, one cloud. No one would touch them without my key. I'd spent most of my life invisible. Not anymore. I opened my notebook again. Flipped past pages of annotated transcripts and coded signals. I wrote, "If silence is how they control the story, then maybe noise is how I take it back." Then I circled one date, February 12th. 2 days before he died. The day Ethan looked me dead in the eye and said, "If anything ever happens to me, go to the logs." He knew. Somehow he knew. And now I needed someone who could see past Elmwood's tidy surface, someone not afraid to shake it. Which is why I answered the unknown number ringing the next morning. A calm voice came through. "Rebecca? Wilson. Yes. This is Special Agent Noah Hartley, Division 6. We need to talk." He didn't give me time to process. "There's a diner off Highway 3. Red vinyl booths, bad coffee corner table near the jukebox. Be there in an hour." Then the line went dead. I sat frozen for a second, staring at the phone in my hand, like it might ring again and tell me this was all a mistake. But it didn't, and I already knew it wasn't. I got in my car, heart thudding, the USB drive tucked inside my coat like it might burn through the fabric. The drive held everything: logs, audio samples, timestamps, and the notebook pages I'd scanned just in case. As I pulled into the gravel lot, I spotted him through the window. Late 30s, dark coat, short hair, no badge on display, but he didn't need one. Something about him said authority without ever raising his voice. Special Agent Noah Hartley, Division 6, Internal Investigations. The kind of man who didn't just show up unless something was already broken. He stood when I walked in, didn't shake my hand, just nodded toward the seat across from him. "You came alone," he said. "It wasn't a question." I nodded. "No one else believes me." He slid a file across the table. I didn't open it, just stared at the label stamped in red. "Classified. Someone tried to erase your name from the logs," he said, tone flat but loaded. "February 14th. Your shift, your station. According to the official system backup, you were never logged in." My breath caught. "That's not possible. I have." "We know," he cut in gently. "We found your manual backups. It's the only reason we're talking." I stared at him. "So you believe me? I believe something happened," he said, "and we need you to help prove what." I opened the file. Inside were screenshots. My dispatch screen, except my name, was missing from the operator ID field. Even the voice sample had been tagged unidentified female dispatcher. "They wiped me," I whispered. "They tried." Hartley leaned back. "Division 6 investigates system tampering, especially involving federal systems like dispatch and law enforcement logs. What you flagged, it's not just a glitch, it's a deliberate overwrite. Someone with high-level clearance tried to erase both the call and you." The words landed like bricks. I'd suspected it, but hearing it out loud, it shook something deeper. Why, I asked, because whoever did it wasn't just hiding a mistake. They were hiding a motive. He took a sip of coffee and didn't flinch at the bitterness. "You said the redirect came from an unverified voice. Do you still have that audio?" I nodded, pulled the tablet from my bag, cued the file and hit play. Static. Code 1033. Then the mimic voice. Calm. Deadpan. Redirect to South Ridge Patrol. Hartley listened, eyes narrowed. When it ended, he said, "That doesn't belong in any dispatch system. This is a synthetic insertion. Someone manufactured this." "I thought it sounded like Ethan," I said. "Like someone tried to make it sound like him." Hartley nodded slowly. Which would make sense, if they wanted to draw him somewhere specific without raising flags. "He told me he was going toward South Ridge," I whispered. "But the route change, it made no sense." Hartley's expression darkened. "Then it wasn't just redirection. It was entrapment. The air around us seemed to freeze. People sipped coffee. Waitresses refilled mugs. The world spun on as if it didn't just tilt on its axis. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Do you arrest someone? Do you take this public?" He looked at me carefully. "We're not there yet. We need more. Your testimony could be pivotal, but we can't officially involve you until we secure clearance to declassify the system logs. And if I speak out before that, I already knew the answer. He didn't sugarcoat it. You'll be discredited. At best, targeted more likely." I exhaled, feeling the weight press heavier. "So I just wait?" "No," he said. "You watch. You record. You keep doing what you've been doing quietly." He leaned in. "This town already buried one truth. Don't let them bury another." I swallowed. "So I'm a witness. Off the record," he nodded, "for now. But unofficial doesn't mean unimportant." A silence stretched between us. Then he asked, "Why'd you keep all those backups?" "Because Ethan told me to," I said simply. "And because they've been erasing me since I was a kid." His jaw flexed. "That ends here. But it only ends if we're careful." He slid a card across the table. No name, just a number. Burner line. "If anything changes, if you feel unsafe, you call." I pocketed it without a word. As I left the diner, the cold hit like a slap. I didn't cry, I didn't shake. I just stood there for a second, watching headlights blur through the winter mist, thinking I've already been erased once. But this time, I'm documenting every second. That night, I encrypted new copies of the logs, sent one to a cloud server in Iceland, one to a friend from college who worked in IT. I printed hard copies, tucked them into a hollowed-out law book on my shelf. Every word, every wave, every echo. Then I opened my notebook and wrote, "They tried to wipe my name. But I'm writing it back in ink. Tomorrow I'd have to go back to work. Pretend nothing had changed. But something had. I had a new ally, and a target on my back. Time to decide if silence would keep me safe, or if breaking it was the only way forward. I had a new ally, and a target on my back. Time to decide if silence would keep me safe, or if breaking it was the only way forward." The next morning, I drove into our cluttered garage before dawn, the cold still clinging to the air, and grabbed my laptop along with a thick folder of printouts, logs, audio transcripts, GPS overlays. My hands shook so subtly I almost dropped everything. I pressed the button to close the garage door and froze. My father was there, leaning against his old sedan headlights, off face-lit only by the gloom of early morning. His eyes were dark circles, mouth, tight jaw, locked like he was holding something in. "Rebecca," he said, voice trembling, just enough to shatter the stillness. "Don't destroy what Ethan stood for." His words were measured, almost pleading, but the meaning was clear. Stop this, or risk the ragged legacy he's left. I took a deep breath and held the folder tighter. "Maybe what he stood for wasn't what you built," I answered coolly, though inside my indictment burned like acid. My reply felt smaller than I'd planned, weak in the face of everything I carried, but it came from a place I couldn't unremember. He straightened the tension coiling in his voice. "You don't understand. Ethan, he believed in this place. He trusted the system. You're shattering that confidence. What if what you're doing brings the whole town down?" His voice broke at the end, heavy with fear, anger, a sense of betrayal I hadn't seen before. I wiped something sharp from my eyes. He didn't trust the system blindly. That's why he told me to check the logs if anything happened to him. He knew something was wrong. Dad's fist clenched on the car's hood. "You're twisting everything. He died doing what he believed in. You're turning that into something else, something ugly," he spat. I swallowed. It's not ugly to want the truth. It's not unwelcome to question what really happened. I met his gaze for the first time in years and saw exhaustion, as though he carried Ethan's death, my betrayal, and our fractured relationship all at once. Mum stepped from the shadows near the garage entry, arms wrapped around herself. Her coat was buttoned too high, her expression distant, unreadable. She watched silently. Her normal warm presence was gone, replaced by the hush of someone pulled inside by the conflict. She didn't step forward. She didn't say a word. But her tightening shoulders told me more than words ever could. My throat ached. This fight had started long before logs and evidence, when I was 10 trying to hide tears under the table, as Ethan got praise for every small thing and I got criticisms I didn't deserve. Now it was happening again, only with higher stakes. Dad shook his head. "You're picking a side against your family, against your father." His voice softened, desperate now. "You have a choice. Stop this. Let it rest." His words echoed familiar warnings from my childhood. Stay silent. Stay useful. Don't upset the order. But I pushed back harder than I'd pushed anyone before. "No. I don't get to stop." I motioned to the folder in my hands. "I won't watch someone manipulate everything and walk away. Not after what he did, what Ethan went through, what he fought for. Not after I lost him." He looked struck, as if everything I'd said shattered him. I stood my ground, waiting for the violent crack of his gaze to explode, or the heaviness to break him. But he turned away, silent, slow. He leaned into the passenger door of the car, head bowed. Mum stepped back further into the shadows. Neither followed me when I shut the garage door behind me. Their absence felt louder than his accusations. Inside the house, I closed the front door quietly. The kitchen clock ticked in the silence. I set the folder down and pulled Ethan's old notebook from my bag. He gave it to me when I started dispatch training, said it might come in handy, though I didn't know for what. Now I did. I sank to the steps leading down to my basement workspace and opened it carefully. The green cover was scuffed. Inside, his handwriting stretched across lines in neat, slanted loops. I thumbed through until I found the page, a single line left in the notebook surrounded by 3 torn-out pages. His words read, "If logs mismatch, it's not a glitch. It's a ghost." My heart hammered. I ran a finger over the letters. Ethan wasn't just warning, he was preparing me, giving me a truth to carry forward. He trusted me enough to leave a message meant for me alone. I flipped more pages and found other clues, half-sketched radar diagrams, radio frequency notes, small margin scribbles, 2 donuts drawn next to a timestamp, marking a late-night shift, and beneath that, a tiny cartoon of the dispatch console with a heart. I remembered that night he slipped the donuts across the counter with a grin, the TV station playing cat memes, and he texted a +1 emoji back when I said I felt invisible in the crew room. He never shouted or complained. He just knew the right moments for quiet support. Now his whispers echoed louder than any shout could. Tears stung again, anger, grief, gratitude. I closed the notebook, hugging it to my chest. I couldn't go back. Not now. Not after this. I pressed open my laptop and drafted a short, firm email to Agent Hartley. Dad confronted me this morning in the garage. I sent you the scan of his notebook page. There's more sketches, timestamps, donuts. He left breadcrumbs. I'm following the trail. I stared at the screen, heart racing. Outside, the sun rose higher yellow light filtering through blinds. I imagined Ethan on his beat that morning, unaware this would be the last time, and I promised I'll follow where you led. I will find the signal you left me. I hit send. The email disappeared into the server, carrying my resolve, my defiance. I tucked the notebook and folder carefully into my bag and headed upstairs. I planned to face Dad, to face Mom, to face whoever else thought I should stop, 1 step at a time. My voice was small, but I was ready to use it. The next morning, as dawn slipped in through the blinds, my phone buzzed with Hartley's message, log tampering confirmed. Sophisticated internal deletion by user with admin privileges. We traced it back to one account, Raina. The name struck me like a punch. Raina, the supervisor who told me to let it go, who dismissed me as not a cop. My pulse quickened. They really were erasing me. I swallowed hard and fired back. I knew it. Thank you. What next? He replied. Need you to confirm what you saw. Official, but off the record. We meet when you're ready. That afternoon, I found Jaime Tran at the station, her face marked by tiredness but brimming with resolve. We closed a closet door to talk. Rebecca, she said quietly, they confirmed Raina wiped your logs and more. He cleaned up a shooting last year, covered it up. My stomach dropped. A civilian was hurt in that one. They said patrol screwed up that Raina made the call to bury it. She nodded. You heard it first, you logged it. But then, files disappeared. My hands trembled as memories flooded back of that chaotic night. I had flagged odd timestamps. Raina called it glitch. I saw it for what it was now, deliberate cleanup. Jamie's voice cut through the haze. We need to go public. I stared, then shook my head. No, not yet. If Raina finds out, he'll delete everything. I need to protect the evidence. Jamie's eyes softened. Then, let me help. I'll gather what I can, camera footage, backup chatter, personnel logs. I thought of the notebook, the recordings, the backups. Okay, I said, but not here. Meet me at my place tonight. She agreed, slipping me her number. That evening, I installed a small security camera above my front door, angled toward the driveway and street. I hate that I'm paranoid now, but paranoia will protect me. I tested the feed from my phone and watched the empty street flicker back. I felt its eyes watching back, silent and patient. While the feed ran, I copied the folder of evidence onto 2 encrypted USB drives, one for my friend overseas, one gifted to Jaime tomorrow. And I emailed the third to a trusted reporter at a national investigative news site with a short note: public interest based on public records. Reveal only if something happens to me. I left no trace of vulnerability. Raina had tried to erase me. Now I was erasing him in a way, making sure the story was bulletproof, redundant, unstoppable. Midnight came, and with it a quiet knock at my door. Jaime slipped inside, coat swirling. Got some good stuff, she said, handing me a micro SD card. Body cam footage from that shooting case shows Raina was there, then ordered files wiped. I exhaled. Perfect. We stayed up late, experimenting, embedding audio clips into password-protected folders, slapping metadata tags only Jaime could remove. We created a chain of custody so airtight it could survive any scrutiny. Around 3 a.m, she hesitated for a moment before she said, "People are watching Beck. Be smart." It was more than advice, it was a warning. I nodded, exhausted but determined. As she left, I walked her to the door, then locked it. I closed the camera feed and watched the empty driveway for a long minute. The story wasn't just mine anymore, it was bigger, and it was dangerous. I packed the USB drives in a slim case, breathed deeply, and whispered to the darkness, "Bring them the truth." I texted Hartley, "Evidence ready. We need to move before it's gone." He replied, "We are ready. Stand by." I powered down the camera feed, but its memory stayed alive on my phone. I switched off the living room light and crawled into the couch, notebook in hand. I wrote a final line before sleep. They erased me. Now they'll see I never disappeared. Dawn would come soon, and with it, I would step forward not as the silent one, but as the one who found the signal. When I pulled into the FBI field office parking lot that morning, sunlight bounced off the sleek vehicles and crisp signage, Division 6, Internal Affairs and Signal Integrity. I paused on the sidewalk a moment to steady myself, feeling the air buzz with official tension and possibility. Inside the lobby was hushed and sterile agents moving with quiet purpose. My steps echoed against tile louder in my head than I expected, as if I was walking into a moment that would define me. Hartley met me at the end of a long corridor, his expression measured. He slid open the heavy door and gestured inside. The office smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Normal, but the sight on his desk caught my breath. A thick, printed dossier lay there, stamped redacted in stark black bars. My name, block after block, erased even from its own story. The sheer volume of censoring felt like a physical blow. He motioned to a chair. I sat, nerves buzzing in my stomach like static. Rebecca Hartley began, voice low. "This is your statement in draft. Someone scrubbed it, struck your presence, or your insights, even descriptions you gave during your interview." He tipped the file toward me. "We need you to fill it in." I opened the folder and pulled out the pages. My eyes flicked across lines where keywords were missing. Dispatcher, Shatitazis flagged anomalies in unit, Yuwashiudza heights at. My role, my words wiped out. Even phrases like "I heard the voice" or "I felt something was off" were gone. I swallowed, pulse thundering. "They erased my voice," I said softly, more to myself than to him. "Yes," Hartley confirmed. "They're trying to reshape the narrative. Control who's telling it." He paused, letting that sink in. "But we need your complete recollection, your voice restored. Not just facts, but context. What you felt, what you feared. That's evidence too." I stared at the blank white spaces on the page, realizing how little power an erasure had until someone chose to push back. My pen hovered. I took a breath, remembering Ethan's smile, his words. "Maybe you hear what others don't." That memory didn't feel like a whisper. I felt it raw. I began filling in the details carefully. describing the spike in my heart when I heard the voice mimic code the chill that trickled into my bones. I wrote how the timestamps didn't align, how one cruiser appeared in two places at once, how Rayner dismissed it like a glitch. I added descriptions. Hartley requested the exact words I used, how I tested the audio frequency, how I flagged it, even though I was told to let it go. Each sentence was an affirmation I saw this. I heard this. I mattered. Hartley asked a question. What was going through your head when the duplicate unit entry flashed on the screen? I looked him in the eye. It was like the system was lying to me, I said quietly. And I couldn't look away. The words felt brittle but true. He nodded and scribbled. Include that. I paused on a redacted section about the dispatch logs being overwritten. I wrote, I felt violated, like someone was reaching into the record of that night and trying to pluck everything that mattered, including my part in it. The sentence trembled on the page. As I spoke, a strange sense of calm settled in me. I was used to being silent, used to being the invisible backup. But here, in this room, at this table, my words were evidence, power. I filled in gaps across multiple pages. At one point, I paused, hand frozen over the paper, because I felt tears prick behind my eyes. It wasn't grief. It was relief. Relief that someone was listening. Someone believed me enough to ask me to speak to echo my truth. Not at a funeral or around my kitchen table, but here. After what felt like an eternity, I set the pen down. Hartley sorted the pages, sliding them back into the redacted folder, now half full of honest detail. Thank you, he said. More than you know. They want to bury this, but your statement gives it roots. I'm not used to being part of the story, I admitted. You should be, he said, offering me a second cup of coffee. He poured, slow, careful. I accepted it, the warmth, stabilizing me. Not invisible anymore, Rebecca? You're our signal, and real signals can't be deleted. We talked more about next steps, chain of custody, how to protect the statement, distribute it securely. I realized this was the first time in years I felt protected by the system instead of sidelined by it. By 1 p.m, I left the office lighter than I'd expected, but determined not just to find the truth, but to tell it, own it. Outside, my phone buzzed with Jaime's message. Rayner's account confirmed. Body cam clip attached. Dates align, he ordered deletion. A file link, I tapped it. There, he was Rayner, on that night in uniform, standing over radios clustered with other officers, then watching records being taken offline. A flash of guilt in his eyes. I paused the video. My chest clenched. Back at home, I opened my notebook and reviewed my words. I added a thought at the bottom. They tried to erase me. But I spoke anyway. Let them redact the paper. They can't redact truth. I wrote another signal found. Transmission started. Sunlight filtered through the blinds. The house felt quieter than normal, maybe because someone next door had asked questions, maybe because logs were being missing, maybe because Rayner knew I was stepping forward. I glanced at my phone. Hartley's number flashed. It was time to move to the next level. This wasn't just a statement anymore, it was a declaration. My voice was out of silence. It had a frequency, and it was broadcasting. The next step came quietly but firmly, getting the raw radio recordings from that night and from weeks before. Hartley arranged access through official channels, FBI tech teams, pulling raw data from dispatch servers and backup systems. A package landed on my desk, dozens of audio files, labelled by date and shift, each with a timestamp. I listened through them, systematically pulling up spectrograms, comparing frequencies and wave patterns. It was like tuning an old radio, tiny shifts in wavelength, the pulsing of voices half hidden in white noise. Then, in one file, I heard a low, steady undertone buried under a routine shift exchange. Not part of the dispatch channel. not coming from the tower. The voice said, Unit 33B check 51R, and then softer, South Ridge diversion in play. I stopped the playback and zoomed into the waveform. The signal was consistent all throughout that entire week every time a certain cruiser was on duty. I cross-checked the vehicle logs. 33B didn't exist. No registration, no assignment. Yet that voice was calling for it, and those calls matched with dispatch reroutes and delayed backup to multiple incidents. That cruiser wasn't in our system because it wasn't supposed to exist. Its frequency was off by a few hertz, too small for routine calibration, but big enough that it wouldn't be picked up by most scanners. Someone created a phantom unit. I pulled up old logs 6 months worth. Then 9. The ghost voice echoed through 9 months of calls, always tied to emergency redirects or backup delays. That meant Ethan wasn't the first. We had a pattern, a trail that went far beyond one death. I thought of Ethan's voice in the backyard that night. He spoke of patterns of signals of listening for things no one else could hear. Suddenly, I realized he wasn't just comforting me, he was teaching me. At our late-night meeting, I showed Hartley the spectrum visuals. Look at this hertz jump at 1.24. He scrolled. And notice how the voice cuts out just before our backup records start. He nodded slowly. That is intentional. Whoever did this, I said, my voice steady has been manipulating calls for months, covering their own tracks. He looked me dead in the eye. This is bigger than Elmwood. Jaime helped too. She pulled personnel shift data for that period. She found that Rayner and a few other officers, whose names we redacted, had access to the dispatch override codes. Beyond that, they were on duty the same nights these ghost redirects happened. It wasn't small time. It was an operation. That night, I sat at my desk with headphones on charts across the table. Lights dim. I listened to the ghost voice again. Unit 33B, divert all resources. Confirm South Ridge. The cold, flat delivery. No emotion. Nothing but compliance. It chilled me, because that voice wasn't a glitch. It was a lie that led officers away. A lie that left Ethan exposed. A lie that killed him. I took a deep breath. I wasn't just recalling calls anymore, I was tracing murder, filling patterns with purpose. I turned to Hartley. Ethan would have heard it. I swallowed, and he trusted me to find it. I was trained to listen to emergencies. Now I'm listening for ghosts. He leaned in. Then we follow those ghosts. We spent hours mapping every satellite frequency, every cruiser dispatch record. It was painstaking. But by morning, we had a picture, dozens of ghost calls over 10 months tied to unregistered units, and repeated by the same handful of insiders. I saved every plot chart and clip into a presentation, my presentation. I opened my laptop at dawn and typed a heading, What You Hear in the Silence. Beneath it, the spectrograms, the linked timestamps, the ghost voice samples. For the first time, it felt real. Not whispers in a dark room, not rumours or doubts. This was evidence, concrete, audible, the sound of a system being broken from the inside, and I had found it. Within days, the ripple became a wave that reorganised my world and the town's. The night the news broke, I lay in bed trying to fall asleep. My phone buzzed continuously beside me, notifications, texts, news alerts. Rayner, finally, had been arrested around midday. I saw the headline while thickening coffee cooled in the kitchen. Supervisor charged with dispatch tampering. My breath caught. It was real. The moment I had feared and hoped for had arrived. Press coverage flooded my feed local channels, replaying footage of Rayner being led out of the station in handcuffs, his uniform pristine, but his face pale and scarred by shock. National outlets picked up the wire. Story officer turned insider threat. Their blurbs left no room for nuance. For weeks, I'd been the silent motor running behind the scenes. Now I was the engine named in every headline. Elmwood's reaction cracked wide like a broken dam. On one side, there was gratitude. I received supportive messages, neighbours leaving kind bars with notes in gratitude for exposing corruption strangers, slipping me notes that said, "You did this and thank you for not letting him get away with it." The hashtag not just a paper dispatcher trended locally. I read them all, each one strengthening me. On the other side, it hurt to think about. I overheard hospital workers whispering as I walked past, "There goes the one who humiliated our town." My parents' friends blinked at me through windows when I passed their houses. Someone no signature slipped an envelope under my door, a folded note reading, "You made our hero a criminal." The words burned my chest. I knew they carried fear, anger, confusion. But I also carried something they didn't: confidence in what I'd found. Fair or not, I was the face of what came next, and I couldn't retreat. Hartley's text came mid-morning the next day. "Meet me in 15. Field office, ASAP." I drove in silence, stomach churning, but resolved. Inside, he handed me an official-looking envelope. I opened it to reveal Division 6, Analyst Training Program Invitation and Badge. Enclosed. My fingers trembled as I removed the badge, cold metal with Agent Rebecca Wilson engraved underneath the agency seal. I raised my eyes to Hartley. He offered a small, proud smile. "Congratulations. You impressed them. They want you on board. We'll support you in putting together your credentials." His voice sounded warmer than usual, like he truly believed I deserved this. I held onto the badge, weight settling into my palm. This wasn't just a token, this was my passage forward. I nodded. "Thank you." 2 weeks later, I walked through the doors of the briefing room with that badge clipped to my belt. Cameras for internal comms were lining the corner. Agents and analysts sat clustered around a large table. Their laughter and shuffling papers stopped as I entered. I paused, breathing in. This was bigger than me now. They were there to review the official report and logs. Hartley stood by the presentation screen waiting for me. I nodded at him. He returned a reassuring gesture. The detective from Elmwood, the one who sneered before, looked up at me. His lips curled slightly in a half smirk as he whispered, "Hope your paperwork's accurate, Miss Wilson." My jaw tightened, but I didn't react. The room shifted. My pulse pulsed loud enough that I felt everyone could hear it. They expected me to snap, to flinch, to freeze. But then Hartley stepped forward. "Good morning," he said loud enough to fill the room. "I'm looking for Agent Wilson." A hush fell. The detective jerked in surprise. I didn't hesitate. I walked to the front, marched past a slip of nerves, and stood tall. "Agent Rebecca Wilson, Division 6, I said firmly, a voice resonant. "You're cleared for briefings." That second, the entire room shifted. Some cached their comments sarcastically. Others straightened respect flickering onto their faces. Cameras clicked. Not the tense buzz of rumour, but the clear hum of official recognition. I pulled the USB with my compiled evidence from my pocket spectrogram charts, audio tracks, vehicle data. I narrated as I connected the ghost voice to the pattern of fatal call reroutes. I detailed my search process. I talked about what I'd felt, not just the words I'd heard. When I finished, a silence held the room together like a breath drawn tight. Then applause. Quiet but certain. Hartley smiled and said, "Thank you, Agent Wilson." In that moment, I realised I wasn't just vindicated personally. I was opening the door for systemic accountability. Outside, afterwards, some reporters were gathered. I decided not to talk. I didn't need to. The story had my testimony now. I walked away with Hartley. He reached lightly onto my arm as we headed toward the stairwell. "You were strong in there. Proud." I felt more than proud. I felt alive. And I thought of the divided town the families hurt. The branches of my own family stretched thin by shock and hurt. This was the moment they'd be forced to see who I really was. Not the shadow behind the dispatch desk, but the woman who found a voice and knew how to use it. I drove to the cemetery early the next morning, the sky still pale before sunrise. The grass was dewy cool under my shoes, and the air smelled faintly of earth and evergreen. I walked to Ethan's headstone, a simple marker under a tall oak, and stopped a few steps away. I didn't kneel. I didn't cry. I just stood, feeling the soft breeze brush the stone. I closed my eyes and breathed in. A distant hum, faint and steady, like a radio tuning into a station on the faint fringe of reception. No tears came. Instead, I felt something settle, something like peace, mixed with purpose. I brushed a strand of hair from my face, looked down at his name, then stepped forward and placed a single white carnation where the earth met the marker. Later, I wandered the rolling hills behind the cemetery where the wind carried the undercurrent of transmitted frequencies. The higher towers nearby broadcast across the valley, silent now, but humming with the promise of connection. I held up my phone near one of the old relay towers listening, and I thought, this is where I belong. A few days later, I stood before the entrance of a new building, FBI Signal Intelligence Training Center. My badge clicked in the sunlight, Rebecca Wilson, Signal Intelligence. I had never imagined I'd wear this name professionally, but seeing it, hearing it, felt like the culmination of years spent being overlooked. The woman who once hid behind console nights, the sister who weathered invisible cruelty, the daughter who held her ground amid family pride and misplaced legacy, I was all of it, and I was stepping into a new role rooted in each piece. Inside the center, buzzed with activity recruits, poring over signal charts, analysts tracing lines on digital maps, instructors walking past whiteboards covered in command-level timestamps. I walked to the briefing room, past shaking hands, nodded at introductions, and then saw Agent Hartley leaning against the wall, watching me. He smiled, nodding. "Ready?" I met his gaze. "Yeah." He handed me a tablet loaded with my first assignment, a deep dive into regional communication anomalies. I tapped the screen and watched the files load spectrograms from multiple sites, logs flagged for irregularities, a list of unregistered unit reports, and one line at the bottom, Case Priority Wilson. I swallowed, heart pounding with purpose. Then I smiled back. The work ahead was vast, heavy, but I was equipped, not with armor or law enforcement intuition alone, but with that lifelong gift. Ethan believed I had the ability to listen. I started walking among the group, pulling up a seat next to a fellow analyst and opening my notes. As I spoke about signal thresholds, about the timeline we'd uncovered about the violence, the ghosts of those entries wrought, people listened. They asked questions. They nodded. They took notes. It felt like something inside me clicked wide open, like the static in a signal finally made sense. At the end of the day, I walked outside the setting sun, painting the horizon gold. I found a quiet bench facing the tower again. I sat thinking of every step that led here, the dinner table where I'd been dismissed, the dispatch booth where I'd learned to sift meaning from noise, the logs I'd backed up the phone call from Hartley, the redacted documents I rewrote, the spectrograms I decoded, the arrest that made headlines. I picked up my phone and almost on impulse recorded a voice message to the void. "Hey, this is Rebecca Wilson. Maybe you're the one listening. Maybe the signal's for you. Stay tuned." I paused the message and deleted it. Not yet. This frequency, the one I was tuning into, deserved more focus than that. But the impulse told me something. My story wasn't only about exposing the past. It was now part of the signal going forward. The wind rustled the leaves. Somewhere, a hidden frequency carried unspoken transmissions. Threats, warnings, cries no one heard. But I wasn't silent anymore. I would listen. And I would act. I pressed play in my head, the line I'd written early on. The world never heard me, but I was never silent. I was just waiting for the right frequency. And now I was on the air. So if you've ever felt invisible, unheard, Like the truth you carry doesn't matter. Just know this. You don't need to scream to be powerful. You just need to tune in to who you are and stay on frequency. Because someone out there will hear you. Someone always does. If this story found you at the right moment, maybe that's not an accident. Hit follow. Stay close. You're not alone.